Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Snow Leopard Conservation, a report from the field, presented by NatHab Expedition Leaders Payal Mehta and Ajay Bijoor. Thank you so much for being here today. Over to you, Payal.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Kobe, for setting us up and helping us with everything. Hello everyone, thank you for showing up. My name is Payal Mehta, and I have been an expedition leader with NatHab since 2014, and I guide in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. You know, today's topic, everyone, is really close to my heart. And I'm delighted to have Ajay Bijoor from Nature Conservation Foundation from India. Nature Conservation Foundation is one of India's leading, nature, science, research, and conservation organizations. And they have a presence in many different landscapes across India. Just a second, I'm just struggling to move the slide. Just give me a moment. Yeah. So yeah, I have a presence. I was saying Nature Conservation Foundation has a presence across many different important landscapes in India, and one of them being the area of the snow leopard. My husband and I, Harsha and I, have been friends of NCF for many years, and also have worked with them as resource people now and again. And this is just an absolute pleasure that I have Ajay from their team, to just have a talk about conservation with all of you. And with that, I will hand it over to Ajay so that he can tell us a little bit more about himself and the organization he works with.
Thanks, Payal, Kobe, and hi everyone. It's great to be speaking with you all. So my name is Ajay, and I work with the Nature Conservation Foundation, and particularly with a program called the High Altitude Program. We work in the high altitude areas of India, and most high altitude landscapes are also snow leopard landscapes. Our program also is associated with the Snow Leopard Trust, which is based in Seattle. The Snow Leopard Trust turns 40 this year, and they work actively in 5 range countries of the snow leopard, supporting local institutions like ours to further conservation efforts. And they've also been trying to mobilize snow leopard conservation across the 13 snow leopard range countries. So they have been very active in trying to protect these high mountain altitudes, high mountain landscapes. Back to you, Payal.
Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, you're so right about, people think of the snow leopard and it's such a mysterious animal, so little seen, that we almost forget that it has such a huge range across Asia, right? 13 different countries. And most of these areas where the snow leopard lives, these are cold desert areas with really extreme dry, very cold temperatures. And that's where the snow leopard has chosen to live, that's where it's adapted to live. And these huge open landscapes, when we visit them, and if an unknowing eye, if it's your first time and you're just driving by, it looks almost barren. Like, what could live here? What could possibly live in this habitat? Until you realize that a big cat, amongst a lot of different wildlife, lives in these landscapes, such harsh, tough terrains. And this is one of the reasons that the snow leopard is the world's most understudied, least understood cat, big cat of the world. So today's presentation, besides talking about conservation that's happening on the field, Ajay, we know you've been doing a lot of scientific research work in the landscapes where you work. And let's start with trying to understand the big cat, a little bit better. So for me, Ajay, when I speak of big cats and when you look at territories, like territorial behavior, something that we know, which we generalize, that okay, the male has usually huge territories with overlap smaller female territories, right? In general, that's the idea we have. And like all cats, they mark their territories voraciously. And when I first went, my first trip to Snow Leopard back in 2014, I was surprised. One of my biggest learning was that they prefer rock overhangs. Like that was their favorite place to mark territories. I know, Ajay, that in your studies, you all have found something, some anomalies, some surprises when you all started learning about the territorial behavior of snow leopards. So please tell us something about it.
Sure, Payal. And like you say, it's hard to study snow leopards for various reasons. And one of them clearly is that these are very remote areas which have very extreme climatic conditions. And like you said, one interesting facet of any species is how they range, just to understand how they behave. And so one way of trying to understand that is by trying to set up these GPS collars on these individuals to study how these individuals move and use space that they have. So our colleagues in Mongolia have actually collared snow leopards, and they've done that for individuals over a period of 6 years. And the kind of results they have shown are quite interesting. Some are probably similar to what other cats show. One is that snow leopards, like several other cats, are solitary. So the male and the female are apart for most part of the year, but they would only come together during the time of mating, which is in the peak winter months. Um, it is also like you were mentioning, the males seem to have a fairly large home range. So based on the studies conducted in Mongolia, it was pointing to the fact that a male snow leopard could have a range as large as 200 square kilometers. Now that's literally the size of the city of Seattle. So it's a fairly large area, and it was interesting to notice that the dominant male had this large area, which would overlap with the areas of the females. So those females would be overlapping in those areas, and there would be these sub-adult males who would be trying to sneak into these areas to sort of uh, to try and capture some of that territory if that were possible. And seen over a period of 6 years or so, you can actually see how these home ranges contract and expand as individuals gain more sort of prominence within that range, or others become less prominent. And yes, like you say, because there are a few individuals in a very large area, how do they communicate? And one way of doing that is by using ways to advertise their presence. And one of that way is to spray. So what you said is perfect. And like you see in this image, typically snow leopards prefer areas which are cliffs and sort of overhangs or broken areas, and they would try and uh, make their presence felt through spraying urine as scent marks, or making these scrape signs, which are basically just an advertisement for any other individuals to know that there are these other individuals as well. So it's one way to advertise to maybe females for the dominant male that he's in the area, but also maybe to warn subadults of this. And typically, if you look at uh, which areas are areas of prominence, you notice that it's where these valleys converge, because these are mountainous areas, but they are not necessarily entirely mountainous. They are also flat and rolling with mountains. So where these valleys converge is are places where many snow leopards are likely to sort of pass through, and in doing so they would also advertise their presence through these signs that they would leave behind. And while all of that is happening, you also have people living there. communities who live there with their livestock, because pastoralism and agropastoralism is probably the primary form of livelihood for much of these high mountain areas where snow leopards also are found. So it's a very dynamic landscape, even though it's very sparsely populated, both in terms of people as well as wildlife.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating for me to hear. When I learned from you, Ajay, that where valleys converge, there could be places where many snow leopards move around.
Yeah. Yes.
Ajay, was also it was interesting for me to learn that, that they use a lot of ridges, right?
Yes. Yes.
Is
So yeah,
that
they prefer to walk along ridges because it sort of, typically these ridges are easier to navigate, uh, and so it becomes and also these ridges are close to these broken cliffs and overhangs, so they would walk along these ridges. And so if you were to try and look for snow leopards, you typically start by looking around these ridges for any signs of their presence and how recent or past or how old those signs are, and then try to sort of figure a way out to see if there has been activity of the cat.
yeah, and also the fact that didn't you find that in some study that females also could have
Yes.
larger territories? Isn't that right? Where was this? Where was this?
Yeah, so there is some ongoing work in India which is seems to be pointing to an interesting difference. So it also makes us remember that it's very hard to generalize these things. And so what seems to be indicative of some of these studies in India is that females seem to be ranging in much larger areas compared to some of the males, or comparably with males, whereas what we had found from Mongolia was probably slightly different, where the females had a smaller ranges than the males. And so there could be several factors which decide how these species range based on just the habitat availability, but also the availability of prey for these cats in these landscapes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Ajay. It's fascinating. It's fascinating that the more we learn, the more we realize, the less we know. Isn't it?
Exactly.
Just as
Yes.
you start generalizing about big cats,
Yes.
another big question, Ajay, for us is this one. It's come up in conversation during trips. It's come up in conversation on Daily Dose of Natures, where so how many snow leopards are there really in the world? Because
Right.
it's very difficult for us, Ajay, to fathom how do you how do you plan conservation? How do you start your efforts? Because this seems to be like the basic information that one would need to put in efforts towards conserving it, and that's what we seem not to know,
Yeah.
right? The fact that we don't know how many exact snow leopards are there in the world, and they're so elusive and so hard to find. So tell us what's the newest in
Sure.
in population studies.
Sure. So Payal, if you were to look up material that is available either in literature or online, there is typically a number that is quoted of there being anywhere between 4,000 and 7,000 snow leopard individuals. Now, having said that, it's also hard to sort of verify that number because, like I said, the snow leopard range, the potential snow leopard range, is estimated at nearly 1 million square kilometers. And for someone to be able to go out and have carried out extensive, scientifically robust studies for assessing the population is very challenging because these areas are remote and are largely inaccessible for certain parts of the year during peak winters and so on. Now, when one starts to assess populations, and how you typically do that is by setting up these camera traps, these remote censored camera traps, which
Mhm.
would stay active. So you would set those up in places um, where you would expect the snow leopards to pass from. So typically, like we were saying, these areas where valleys converge and overhangs, which are likely to be used by these snow leopards, are places where you would set up camera traps. And like you see in the image here, that's typically it's about walking into these areas for a long time and then trying to find the ideal site and then setting up a camera there, and then leaving it on for 45 to 60 days, hoping to capture whatever movement happens before it. Now, because it is such a difficult exercise, typically what happens is that you would tend to set up camera traps in places where you are likely to expect snow leopards to be there. And so if you were to conduct a study in a small area, which you think has snow leopards, and you come up with an estimate, and then you extrapolate it to the entire potential snow leopard range, then it could be misleading, because you would be then working with the assumption that snow leopards are found across the entire area, which may not necessarily be the case. So what's happening currently, Payal, is that these 13 range countries have come together, and they have launched something they call PAWS, which is the Population Assessment of the World's Snow Leopards, where each country is trying to make a robust assessment of the snow leopards in their own country, while acknowledging the fact that it will not be possible to go and set up camera trap in every nook and cranny of the potential snow leopard range. So they have devised a method in which it's a two-step method, which will account for these kind of factors, and hopefully it will allow us to come up with the first sort of robust estimate. Now, in India, it's also going on, and we've been part of setting up camera traps in a potential area of about 27,000 square kilometers. And it's fascinating because you set up a camera trap, and often you leave it on. You have to go and check these cameras from time to time. Like I said, these can be extreme conditions. So there are times when you lose camera traps to an avalanche, or it's just so cold that the batteries drain out, or you end up setting up a camera trap and there is a blade of grass which grows through summer, and it just that triggers the camera and it just takes pictures of those blades of grass. And what typically happens after setting up, say, 30 or 35 camera traps is that you end up with a dump of about 30 to 35,000 images, of which only a few hundred might be those of snow leopards. So the real work actually starts after having done this bit of field work, which by itself is a staggering amount of, and requires a staggering amount of effort. And then there is this whole effort of bringing all those images, looking at them, then trying to sort the images of snow leopards and the other species. And based on those individual species, you're looking at trying to identify individuals based on the patterns of the rosette patterns that these individuals will have. Now, interestingly, there is again a scope for errors to be there in this case, because it's uh, there is no, so much of this is being done manually. So the whole identification process is done manually. Um, there are there are some AI tools being developed to try and see if this can be done, sort of uh, uh, using AI, but that's still in a very nascent stage of development. And so recently there was this study in which uh, they worked with zoo individuals, so individuals whose identity was known, who were in the zoo, snow leopards, and their images, camera trap images, were used and given to people who analyzed these images, and they found that even with that, there were some anomalies in identification, so it was leading to an overestimate. So one has to be mindful of all these things, and like you said, this remains a big question of whether what's the number of snow leopards across the globe, and hopefully we should have a slightly better and a well-informed answer in the coming 2 to 3 years, hopefully.
Amazing, amazing, Ajay. Just listening to you, I'm just wondering what a mammoth task it is. One, the field work that happens, going about in these remote, harsh weather conditions, putting up camera traps, looking after the camera traps, monitoring those. That's one part. And then another part of the mammoth task is when all the footage reaches indoor computer systems or AIs or artificial intelligence machines, like you said. But none of it is easy. None of it is straightforward. And listening to you, I can't ignore the fact that 13 countries have come together and said, okay, let's work on this. It's amazing for me to hear that 13 different countries in today's world have united
Yeah.
to work on something good, isn't it?
Yes.
It's just amazing. Yeah.
It leaves. It's very very encouraging to say the least.
I'm sure, Ajay. Fantastic. Ajay, thank you for that. And I'm going to move on to the next sort of subsection of this is the actual conservation work, right? So in India, Ajay, when I think of India, the first cat, of course, that comes to mind very often, the most popular one rather to say is the tiger. And or any other big cat, maybe the leopard even. And we think of all the past conservation efforts that have happened in India is to cordon off an area, of cordon off a patch of forest which is solely kept for animals, from where you remove any human use or human populations. You remove it out and keep it outside. Here, what you see on the computer, everyone, is an aerial image of one of the national parks in India, which is called Bandhavgarh National Park, which is in central India. And here you can see a clear boundary, even in this aerial image, where at the bottom you can see the forest and all the villages which may have or may not have been, inside the forest at some point, have all been moved outside the boundary of the forest. And typically in these forests, when you go for a safari in central India, for example, you're likely to come across a mosaic of grasslands and wooded forests. And these grasslands are remnants of what once upon a time used to be villages, where tribal people used to live. They used to have their homes, they used to have their little farms. But all of those, they still exist, but outside the boundary of the park. Even today, in spite of this effort has been quite successful so far, at least, tiger populations are doing better, but still we do have conflict every now and again where a tiger has picked up a cattle like you see in this image from just beyond the boundary from the village. But it seems like we can't really apply that directly. It's not one size fits all when it comes to the big cats of India. When you look at the snow leopard scenario, Ajay, it seems impossible to be able to remove this people out of this landscape, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's an interesting and a sort of example you start off with, Payal, and that image spoke for itself. There's this very hard edge between where the forest ends and where human inhabitation starts, as we could see in that aerial image that you shared. And that's partly because for several parts of the country in India have a very high human population density now, and that is something that is unique in the snow leopard landscapes, at least in India, which is that the human population densities are very very low. So it's in probably the range of 1 to say about 5 people per square kilometer, which sounds absolutely unheard of for a country the size of India. And so, if you were to come into these high altitude landscapes where we find snow leopards, you would also find people, but not in very large numbers. So even habitations that you would find are scattered and spread across large areas, but in very, very small numbers. So it's interesting because most of these communities have, like I said, have been pastoral or agro-pastoral. So you have communities that are pastoral and who are nomadic in nature. So they actually, even now, they shift with their all of their baggage and all of their equipment through the course of the year in a large flat area, which is maybe about 16,000-17,000 square kilometers. There are other which have now become sort of sedentary, who have sort of settled in with land, and they grow uh, a crop for the very short summer season that these areas see. But then they also have livestock. And so people live in these areas, but not in very large numbers. And also, if you look at wildlife, you will find wildlife across these areas, but not in very high densities, in not very high numbers. So it's very hard to draw that boundary in saying that, oh, this is a village and I will not find wildlife here, or oh, this is a wooded area or a forested area and this is where I'm likely to find wildlife. You are as likely to see a snow leopard close to a village as you might be of seeing it a little away from the village. And so both people and wildlife have lived alongside, and this is not something recent. This has been around for generations. In fact, there are petroglyphs from these areas which date back to something like 5,000 years, which show depictions of people and wildlife in the same image. So people and wildlife have sort of lived alongside each other for many generations now. And with that, there are likely to be instances of sort of negative interactions or conflicts between them. And if you were to look at it also from, like I said, the range of the snow leopard, which is about, like we said, was about 200 square kilometers. Now if you look at the average size of a protected area, uh, if you were to create protected areas of those sizes, uh, they would probably not support more than one mating pair of a snow leopard. So just this whole idea of creating protected areas and sort of removing human activity might not work in these landscapes. And to flip that around, you might want to acknowledge the fact that people and wildlife have persisted in these landscapes for generations now, and it is probably they who have actually sort of in a way been able to live alongside with these wildlife. And so any efforts at conservation should in fact include them and their views, and in trying to make sure that it is done in a manner that is ethically correct and just. And so that is one stark difference, where the way we try to put it is that it is to take a landscape level approach, to look at a very large area of say 10,000 square kilometers or so, and then to look at how people and wildlife, which are the areas of high wildlife value, and how can people and wildlife live alongside each other.
Yeah, absolutely, Ajay. And I think as we move on in this world with more technology and just newer learnings, it's also only, it's only natural, it's only wise of us to change the way we look at wildlife and people. And maybe, like you said, in this case, it's best not to separate the
Yeah,
two, as we go. That's such a wonderful way of thinking. I really love the whole idea actually of not removing people out of your conservation efforts, or even from the perspective we look at wildlife, from. And that brings me, Ajay, to the next question. Is, like you said, these people, the local people of these areas, who live with the snow leopards, they're one of their biggest occupations is grazing. But in this landscape, you also have wild ungulates, right? Like the ibex that you're seeing on the screen just now, or you have the blue sheep, or even which are smaller, and then you even have bigger ungulates like the wild ants. And when you think of domestic grazing, domestic cattle, usually wherever you hear from any part of the world, they are the problem in the landscape, right? They are eating the same food, there's competition for food, there's competition for space. How do you think this is affecting, or how do you think, what's happening,
sure.
what's the dynamics here in
Yeah.
for snow leopard? Yeah.
So, yeah. So, Payal, here again, I think it will be very hard to generalize and say that it is good or bad, because I think the answer might be far more nuanced. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if I were to talk about the Indian perspective, and specifically parts of Ladakh and Himachal Pradesh where we've been working, uh, the fact remains that these communities have been rearing livestock not in the last few decades, but like I said, for many, many generations. Uh, and uh, and there are these within that whole practice of rearing livestock, there are these highs and lows that take place, where populations can increase and decrease depending on how their downstream markets are and so on. But the fact remains that, and one can always make an argument that, oh, if there were no livestock, then maybe that area would have become available to wildlife. um, but to again, to play devil's advocate, that land could also become available to some other form of land use, which could be more extractive in nature. And we have come to believe, at least in these places where we work, we believe that herding is probably the least sort of ecologically unfriendly, if I could call it, form of land use, and that it has persisted over several generations, allowing for wildlife to also exist alongside. And so it, it's not one something being good or bad. And so, like you see in this image, there are these communities, like I said, who are pastoral, who have been shifting, and it gives rise to instances of negative interactions between people, their livestock, and wildlife. And so the effort that people like us, or our organizations like us, are trying to do is to try and see how we can either minimize these kind of negative incidents, and we also realize that it's not we won't be able to completely take away those negative interactions. So one common way of loss is happening is when a snow leopard or a wild carnivore enters a corral like the one you see here, which is open, and then they come and sort of damage multiple livestock in a single instance, which is often called surplus killing. They'll just come and kill a bulk of the livestock. So it's almost like, you investing in a stock, and you wake up one morning and you realize that the value of your stock has come down by half its value. That's how a herder might feel. So the efforts that we've been trying to make is to work with these herding communities to see how these losses can be minimized by preventing these incidents, or by trying to set up mechanisms to cope with financial losses if incidents like this do take place. But we believe that, our effort is to try and make sure that this form of coexistence can continue. And like I said, it's a dynamic situation, because these places are also seeing newer forms of livelihood now coming in through tourism, through other forms of livelihood, as the younger generations go out, get educated, and come back. So herding itself is at a sort of a position of whether it will happen or not, and so on. And so we hope that it will continue, because it's not just a form of livelihood, but it's also a deeply cultural aspect of their form of life. And so one other way of us trying to work with these herding communities is through trying to set up livelihood intervention. So something that we are just starting off is the idea of wildlife friendly cashmere or wildlife friendly pashmina, because the pashmina from some of these parts where it's grown is probably the best pashmina in terms of quality, but it's also being grown in a socially and an ecologically sensitive manner. And we are trying to see if we can now link these herders to a market which is willing to pay a premium price for their produce, thus in turn allowing them to take herding forward with future generations. Because if herding were to sort of phase out, it's likely that some other form of land use will come in, and we don't know if that form of land use is likely to be as sensitive of the local ecology as herding currently is. Yeah, and like you see in this image, this is the typical image of how a high altitude pasture would be. And I can see a few kiang also, wild asses in the frame. And these are exactly the places where these communities will also be grazing their livestock. So you might see them sort of in close vicinity of each other. But they have been doing that for a very long time, and for several generations now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Should we move on to our next question?
Sure.
So, okay, so this is my favorite part. All the work that NCF has done across India, elsewhere, most ways of conservation effort anywhere in the world, and that's about wolves. So first of all, um, you know, when we say wolves in India, most people even struggle to believe that there are wolves, right, in the country. Can you all hear me?
Payal, I think there is a slight issue with your voice breaking, but I see the point you are trying to make about how uh, usually people don't associate wolves with India, and how you talk about wolves, and India is not the first place that comes to one's mind. But interestingly, while we've been talking about snow leopards in these parts, these landscapes are also home to the wolves, the Tibetan wolves. And if you were to go and speak to a herder, they're likely to be more sort of concerned about wolves than of snow leopards, because in their minds, wolves are likely to be uh, killing more of their livestock than snow leopards would. And so this has been a challenge in these parts. And one way in which these communities have dealt with this situation is through something they call shangdongs, and it's probably one of the images that is likely to come up. Now, shangdong literally means it's a combination of two terms. It's shanku and dong. So shanku is wolf and dong is a trap. So it's literally a wolf trap in which they would keep a live bait. And their way of explaining it is very, very interesting, because what they say is that wolf traps are set up and you put a live bait in this, like the image you see here, and you would have a live lamb or a sheep or a goat. And they say that the wolf, out of its sort of greed, jumps into this trap. And the walls of this structure are sort of inverted, so once the wolf is inside, it finds it hard to jump out. And typically what would happen then is, if a wolf were trapped, then it would be stoned to death. And if you were to speak to these herders, their way of seeing it is that it is a way of trying to protect their livestock. While I first started seeing this as a way in which people were killing wolves, for a herder it was a way of protecting his or her livestock, and which is not, I think, completely wrong. I think when you are living in a difficult terrain with meager resources, you will have to make every effort to try and make sure that you preserve what you have. But of course, over the years, this practice has sort of phased out, but these structures still persist. These structures are still found in many parts of Ladakh. And so we were sort of having these conversations with these herders to see what can be done, if at all. And one idea that sort of came out through these conversations was the idea of converting these into stupas. So basically, a stupa is a Buddhist structure which is regarded as having religious significance. And so what they've done is to sort of neutralize the structure that of the shangdong by opening the trap door that is there to the shangdong, while retaining the structure, because the structure is a memory of a past, of a difficult past, of their ancestors. And so without necessarily doing away with the entire structure, what they've done is they've built this stupa as a reminder of this practice, but also taking an oath to not continue this in future, and to not continue causing harm to wildlife in future. And there I think it's important to reiterate the role that religion can also play in some cases. And essentially in these parts, most communities are Buddhist, and so the spirit of compassion and towards all sentient beings is preached right from a very young age, and is also practiced in many ways. And it's just a coincidence that we are having this conversation today, which is happens to be the 86th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so, this was something that we started off a few years back, and we are hoping to sort of work with more herding communities to see if they will be open to taking up these kind of initiatives, to voluntarily give up uh, uh, the practice of causing any harm through their own actions, and to sort of live alongside wildlife in a manner that they can both sort of exist alongside.
That's so amazing, Ajay. Really, really, what a fantastic story. I've heard it so many times and I yet again enjoyed hearing it again. It's amazing the work all of you have done, ranging from hardcore science and research to local traditions in grazing and herding to religion, just encompassing every single aspect of the landscape and not just looking at wildlife through a narrow lens. So really huge congratulations on the work that you and everyone at NCF, at Nature Conservation Foundation and Snow Leopard Trust does. And thank you so much for teaching us so much, straight from the horse's mouth, that we've learned today about snow leopards, the people, the landscape, and all the efforts that are going on, Ajay. So thank you so much. And I think we are now ready and open for questions.
Sure. And thank you for this opportunity. I'm glad I could just share some of these things with you all.
Thanks, Ajay.
Well, thank you both very much. This is fascinating, continues to be. We have a lot of great questions today. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone that you could submit your own questions via the questions field that's in your control panel. So let's see, to start, how about if we just start with a little bit of snow leopard biology? What wild game do snow leopards prey upon, and do they hunt alone or together?
Right. So in India, the primary prey species, some of the images that Payal was showing, these are these wild ungulates, which are basically species of wild sheep and goat. So the bharal, or the blue sheep, is considered the primary prey species in some of these places where of Ladakh, and where we are in India, and also the ibex. And typically they would hunt individually. So like I said, these are solitary cats, and they sort of come together only around the time of the courtship, and then the mating in the peak of winter. So it's usually the hunts are solitary. Of course, there could be incidents of where a mother and has a cub, or has more than one cub along, and that if that cub is sort of a subadult, then there could be instances where you see more than one individual. But typically, it's more likely for you to see individuals in a hunt.
Very good. How does a snow leopard different from the cloudy leopard or the other leopards in Africa, specifically in the Kruger?
So one thing I would think is, if you look at where these species are found, it's clearly like Payal showed in her initial slides, is in these high mountain areas. So the typical connotation that is made is that they are found in areas which are sort of above the tree line. And so their adaptation is to be able to survive in these extremely cold conditions. So one thing, like for example, if you look at this image, if you look at the size of the tail, it's as long and probably maybe even longer than the length of the body. And these are the kind of adaptations that the species has evolved over generations to be able to adapt to these extreme cold conditions, and the kind of landscapes that you would find them in. So I think one thing that sets this species apart from the species that you would find anywhere else is the fact that it survives only in these extremely cold conditions, cold dry conditions, and as the case is in India, that happens to be these high altitude conditions, which are like above 3,500 meters of altitude.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. The next question is there any interaction, or what do we know about the interactions between snow leopards and the wolves?
So there is very little we know. So what happens is, like we were saying initially, the snow leopards tend to prefer areas which are rugged, which are sort of broken areas and so on, like the ridge lines which Payal referred to. Whereas the areas wolves prefer are more flat and more open, because uh, what snow leopards rely on for hunting are these areas where they can sort of sneak on the predator, on their prey, and then sort of be able to surprise attack them through the cliffs and so on. Whereas because wolves are pack animals, they would rely on sort of running down their prey and sort of being able to hunt in a pack. So the kind of habitats they tend to use are slightly different, even though they may be found in the same sort of area. And like I was saying, these are very large areas in terms, and they're very sparsely populated. So while there haven't been any focus studies in trying to sort of to study interactions between snow leopards and wolves, the other actual interaction that is being studied is the interaction between wolves and free ranging dogs. So there are which we haven't spoken of, and I may not go into that in very much detail, but these landscapes also have a lot of dogs, which are not wild dogs. These are like domestic dogs who have sort of grown in numbers, and there is a lot of interaction happening between wolves and them, which some people have tried to study in some ways.
Very good, very good. So we have a lot of questions on the conservation of snow leopards.
Sure.
So maybe I can package up a couple of these together for you,
Sure.
Jay and Payal, and you can just comment on the whole thing, on the whole package. So the first questions have to do with cameras, like what are their cameras like? Do they go off at a particular time? Are they motion activated? How long are they out for? And then also going along with sort of tracking and monitoring the collars that they're getting. It sounds like most of those are telemetry, but are there GPS collars on there as well? Can you see where those leopards are moving in real time?
Yeah.
So this.
Yeah. Payal, you want to
Yeah,
come
sorry,
in?
Ajay, I would like you to take these questions. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the first question about the camera traps is, yes, they are motion activated. So there are two sensors in the camera trap. One is the motion, and the other is temperature. So when an object of a certain temperature and showing some movement comes before it, it triggers the cameras, and then you can set. So if you see this image, what it shows on top is the date, but also it shows 9 out of 10. So the camera was set up to take 10 images once it detected motion, and so it would fire 10 times, and then if it still sensed motion, it would fire 10 more shots. And it also shows you on the top right the temperature and the battery. So you see it's touching -4 degrees Celsius, and your battery has drained to half. And temperatures can go as low as -20 and even lower actually. And that's when we've observed that cameras get completely drained out, and then once the sun comes out, the camera might just restart. And so typically these cameras are set up for anywhere between 45 to 60 days, and that depends on the kind of study you are trying to do. So it's guided by the study design. And so while it's out for that period of 45 or 60 days, you need to go out and check it at least once or a couple of times to see A, if the batteries are still running, and B, if the data cards haven't been exhausted, because that's something that you need to go and do. And to the question on telemetry, yes, these are GPS collars. So you can get you do get information, but there's a trade-off. Now typically the idea of this of a GPS of a collaring study is to just understand the movement of the animal, right? And so it won't necessarily matter to you if you are getting that information in real time, because what happens is it goes into the logger, and then that and at a set interval that information will be sent to the satellite, and then you would receive an update of or a dump of the information. Now the higher the fee, the sort of information you try to seek, the faster you are likely to drain the batteries of the collar, and the collar would sort of stop functioning. So I think most often the collars that are set up are not necessarily trying to sort of give you updates in real time, though you might get those with a lag of a day or a few days based on what settings you have made. And typically once these collars are set up, you go and look for the animal if you find that it is giving the same location for a certain number of days, because that either means that the animal is on a kill, which is what is keeping it at that site for a prolonged time, or something might have happened to the animal, in which case you would want to go there and see that it's what is the reason for that. So yeah.
Great, fantastic. Let's see, we have a few more conservation questions. There's another one that's related to some of the camera trap information. Are there any projects where citizen scientists can help identify relevant camera trap photos?
Yes, so the Snow Leopard Trust is a kind of working, like I said, what happens is when you set up a bunch of camera traps, so when you typically go out, you would set up 30, 35, even more camera traps, depending on how many cameras you have access to. And like I said, it's a big logistical exercise, because your monitoring will only start when all your cameras have been set up, and sometimes setting up a single camera can take 3 or 4 days of walking inside the valley. So it has to be done keeping a lot of permutations and combinations in mind. Now when we complete a camera trapping exercise, we do end up with a ton of information, and the first level of sifting we try to do is to sift by species. So whether it's a snow leopard or it's not a snow leopard, even that can be an important level of sifting information, or is it some other species that one is able to identify. And I think that is where we are trying, or at least the Snow Leopard Trust is trying to see if we can make use of people's enthusiasm who would want to come and look at images and help sort them out, and have multiple people doing that, so that you have a certain level of certainty in the fact that this sorting has happened to a certain level. So I think we are at that level at this point. And ideally you would also want to go ahead and make sure that people can contribute in trying to IDing these snow leopards and so on, but I think we are still a little away from that at this point.
I understand. Let's see, there are a few more questions that have to do with conservation that I think are important. How specifically are organizations like yours trying to help villagers become more involved in the conservation of snow leopards?
So for us, as the Nature Conservation Foundation and also the Snow Leopard Trust, I think that is one of our stated objectives, that we believe that conservation has to be with the communities. And so I mean, one of the things we try to ensure is that it's community-based conservation. And we try. I mean, I know that one can still find limitations in the way an organization might be approaching it. But what we would definitely try to do is to make sure that we have involved the local community in the discussions of setting up any intervention. So typically what the research allows us to do is to identify a threat, but how do you address that threat is something we've come to realize is best done in discussion with the local people, because they often have ideas of what a solution might be, and there could be reasons that are keeping them from being able to implement that solution. And so I think in that case, what we might be trying at best is to be facilitating that process. And we realize that with that there is also ownership of that intervention. Otherwise they would need us to be there all the time, whereas I think what we acknowledge is the fact that these people have lived with wildlife for a very long time, and the best we can do is to just help them or nudge them in a way that they are capable of doing that, even in the time to come.
Ajay, there's a question here particular to Afghanistan, but maybe just in general. What impact does ongoing political strife in the region have on snow leopard populations?
Yes, and that's an important question also, because it is likely to affect, because A is that it can possibly lead, I mean, you can't remove these species away from the people of the landscapes. Is something that, like, I've been stressing on through this presentation, because if there is strife and if there is challenge within the landscape, it is likely to sort of affect the ecology and the wildlife of that region as well. And one of the concerns is that some of these snow leopard landscapes are, it's across shared boundaries between these 13 countries, and some of these are in the midst of a lot of geopolitical turmoil. And so yes, it does affect. And it's also because, you see, the primary prey species for the snow leopard are these ungulates. And so if those populations are likely to be affected for whatever reason, if there is excessive hunting in certain cases, or any other reason which causes their populations to go down, it is likely to take a toll on the population of snow leopards. So all of these things seem to be linked, and so we realize that for any effective conservation to happen, there is a need for us to also look at the social side of it, the social and the cultural side of it, because conservation essentially needs you to largely work with the people in these places, while you hope that whatever action is taken will ultimately then benefit the species also.
Very good. One more conservation related one. We have a few viewers that are curious if drones are being used at all to try to track leopards in these expansive areas.
So I don't think they are being used as part of sort of formal research, though there are some sort of pilots being done. Now, one of the challenges, like I was saying, is that some of these areas are very, very remote and are sort of boundaries between two countries. And so in at least in India, several of these parts are sort of geopolitically sensitive, and so the ability to use drones might automatically be negated because of that. But I know that some of our colleagues in Kyrgyzstan, for example, are trying to make use of drones to see if those can be used, not necessarily to track snow leopards, but to see if they can be used for doing surveys for wild ungulates. So there are these techniques which we use, which again involve people walking into these valleys and trying to sort of sight these ungulates. But now they're trying to see if you can set a path for a drone, and if a drone can fly through that area, and if that works. So it's again, it's in a very sort of initial phase. The challenge with snow leopards will be that they are usually active, after sunset. So it's sort of active early in the mornings, or sort of towards dusk. So there it could be a challenge to be able to work with drones, given that snow leopards tend to be very, very specific in terms of their time of being active.
Interesting. So we've had a lot of questions today. They're all very, very good. I love everyone's participation. We'll go maybe just a few minutes over today. Ajay, how do you feel about a little rapid fire session here? I think that I have some questions pulled together that are all very quick
Sure.
answers, and
I,
maybe we
I
can cover a lot of bases. And then we have some questions specific to the NatHab trip, and maybe we'll finish there.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, here we go. The primary diet of the snow leopard is
livestock as well as wild ungulates, bharal, blue sheep.
okay. The female snow leopards, when they traverse their range, do they also mark their presence with urine like the males?
Yes, they do.
Do snow leopards use their tail for balance?
Yes, they do. And they also do it. I mean, we've read this. I have not seen it myself, but they say that they also use it to sort of cover their nostrils or the nose in the extreme cold.
Ah, yes, like the Arctic fox does. That makes a lot of sense. Wonderful. Let's see. Does the male snow leopard kill the cubs sired by another male?
There is. I mean, I personally I haven't come across any instance of that kind, but there is a general perception of that sort, that the cubs could be at risk. But I, at least myself, haven't read or heard of those kind of incidents. But I'm not the best, and there could be people who know better.
Fair enough. Thinking about conservation again, are snow leopards poached for their hides or any other part?
Yes, so there is a dimension of illegal wildlife trade, and more than their fur, it's also for their bones and for sort of traditional medicinal purposes. So that is something that is also a sort of big risk. And again, because these areas are remote, it's very hard to trace.
Okay, one final question about conservation. You mentioned earlier in a slide showing a national park where it sounded like the Indian government had forced people, villagers, to move their communities outside of the national parks. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can do that. And Payal, yeah, Payal, if you would want to, I think you might be even better to take that one.
Sure. I can take that one. So this was back in 1974 when our only lady Prime Minister Indira Gandhi started something called Project Tiger. And at that time, the population of tigers had really started dwindling, and we were in a bad shape. And that's when the wisdom at that time said that let's create a sanctum sanctorum for animals, for wildlife to survive. And tiger that time was seen as the umbrella species. And that time, villages were relocated outside of where the boundary of the parks were made. Forced, I don't know if I'd use the word forced for each and every single instance, while there were some times when there were opposition to this kind of an activity, conservation-based activity. But each time that the villages were relocated outside, they were provided with pieces of land, better healthcare, things like electricity or access to roads sometimes, education, small schools set up, which maybe otherwise before that weren't accessible to them. So yeah, we can't generalize in a country like India. We can't generalize anything, and similarly, not even the fact that they weren't really forced each time.
Okay, thank you. And then the last few questions we have here relate specifically to the NatHab trips. So we have a number of viewers wondering how likely it is for participants to see a snow leopard while on the trip.
So Kobe, it's quite a decent chance. It's quite a good chance. And that's also the fact that it's kind of hard to see snow leopards. It's also the reason why we have longer trips in the, where we spend more number of days in the same destination. And to help the cause, we have local spotters who are experts at at picking out snow leopards from the surroundings, because as you all know, they are the ghost of the mountains. They're so well camouflaged that these expert eyes, the local spotters, help us spot them. So to answer coming back to the question, you have a fairly good chance of seeing a snow leopard.
No, that's wonderful. It sounds like a lot like our wolf trips in the way that it works, and we have great success there too. Let's see. The other question we have about the trip has to do with the physicality of it. Like, is it a strenuous trip to go see the snow leopard, or what might that experience be like for people?
Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about the trip. Where NatHab is going to be, the accommodation is fairly comfortable. It's like a little lodge, not luxurious, but certainly comfortable. We do have road access to many parts where we go look for snow leopards. There might be some amount of walking, but very rarely is it too strenuous or too steep. So one of the biggest challenges actually physically in this trip is to be able to deal with the cold, because these trips happen in winter, and like Ajay was saying, it can be very, very cold, sometimes even minus 20 degrees Celsius, right? And the best time to see the snow leopards is either early in the morning, just as the sun is coming out, or late in the evening when the sun is going to set. And the moment the sun goes behind the mountains, the temperature just falls so quickly that from a bright sunny day, it just within minutes shifts to below freezing temperatures very, very quickly. But otherwise, walking wise, so far as you can do fairly good walks, you should be able to do this trip quite well. Because of the high altitude, if you have some amount of training back at home where you've done walks or runs, it helps, because the oxygen, the air is quite thin, and you tend to get breathless more quickly than you would at a lower altitude. I hope that helps.
Yes, it helps a lot. Thank you. So I think that's the last question we have time for today. How about right now, I'll hand it back to you two for closing remarks. Ajay, should we begin with you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this was great. I'm glad I could come and share some of my experiences, and I really enjoyed the questions as well. So I'm glad people stuck around and were there just to ask those questions. And I hope to I look forward to meeting some of them if they come to Ladakh soon.
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks, Ajay. I think we will do that. If I do end up there with some of our NatHab guests, I will check if you're around, and we should definitely have you meet some of our guests in person. I think it'll be a wonderful experience. Thank you so much. We have learned so much from this presentation today. I do not have words to explain. And thank you everyone for showing up. Thank you, Kobe, Kendall, as usual, for helping us with everything technical, everything in the background. Without you, none of these would be possible. And thank you, NatHab, for having this platform of Daily Dose of Nature, where people like me, Ajay, all of us can come and talk to you about things we love. So yeah, that's it from us.
Well, Payal, AJ, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I'd like to also thank everyone who's tuned in today. Reminder to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.